Terrific. It's great to be here today, and we're going to talk a little bit about several different things. Let's talk a little bit about historical production, then currently what people are growing, and then I'm going to go through a survey I did and some cultivar options for growers to consider, and hopefully you can talk about later in the afternoon. First of all, I love this slide that Bernadine dug up for another presentation that she and I gave about a year ago to the North American strawberry growers. But this was the Pony Express equipment for carrying fresh strawberries, I guess up in Hood River somewhere. And it's just impossible to imagine that these would be carried on horseback or wagon, but that was the start of some of the fresh market. As far as if you look, Matt talked a little bit about some figures. These go back. I probably could have tried a little harder to get the California figures, but it sort of shows that back in the late 40s, we were up at about 15,000 acres. It dropped down to about 5,000, rose up to about 7,000 in the late 80s into the early 90s, and then it's tapered off. Although if you look a little more closely at the last 10 years, it's been pretty stable. I think this is British Columbia down here and Washington right here. So Washington stayed pretty stable all along as well. Whereas, I do like to point out, this is when I arrived, which is the last peak. And I'm sure there's no correlation here, but because I didn't have anything to do with prices. If you look at production, certainly back in the late 80s, we were up at those figures of 90 million pounds, but that was a high for a long time. Before that, it was a lot lower. And this is looking at, first of all, Oregon processed here, then Oregon fresh right here, and then Washington fresh and processed are pretty close together there. So, just like Matt alluded to, certainly the production has been declining, although since about 2006 it's been about the same for processing. And fresh has sort of just bumped along. It hasn't really taken off, nor has it dramatically declined or increased, which is kind of surprising to me. I would have, when I put these figures, when I popped in these figures for the graph, I sort of expected this to be rising larger than it has at the end, but it hasn't.
Chuck, can you help the group where these numbers come?
USDA Economic Research Service is where all these figures come from. And if anybody ever wants the spreadsheet, all worked up, I've got 40 years of data for a lot of different crops compiled into one Excel spreadsheet. If you look at the price over time, and we've got, it was kind of interesting to me because you have, Oregon fresh and Washington processed has been steadily increasing, and that's good to see because sometimes you see these figures and growers just aren't asking enough for their crop, but we have steadily been increasing, whereas the processed price, I guess if you forced a regression line to that, the price is increasing, but it's certainly increasing at far less a rate than the fresh price. If you put California on top of that, I thought that was kind of interesting because really, quite honestly, California, for their fresh market, is not doing nearly as well as here. Their price really is, while it is, you could draw a regression line that's increasing there, it's not going up that much. So what California has been counting on is, they have increasing costs down there and they're not getting great increase in price. So new varieties, higher yields per acre have has allowed them to even stay in the business with this kind of graph. And this is the process price for California. So that's sort of the historical production in the region and the prices in the region. If you look at what's being grown now, the Pat Moore works with the nurseries to get plant sales, and this is the plant sales for the last 4 years compiled. Totem has still been the #1 producer, and that's primarily for processing. Albion, primarily for fresh. Tillamook, mostly for processing. Hood, a mixture, and on down the line. Most of these, once you get down to these smaller varieties down here, are in somebody's fresh operation, or I'm never quite sure, some of this may end up, I'm not sure anybody's really growing quinol, but I certainly know every garden center I go to carries quinol. So that may be where some of those kind of cultivars get onto the map. Also keep in mind, it's sort of hard to figure, but as far as trying to figure out what these plant sales mean, something like Totem is usually kept in the ground for 2 years. Something like Albion, 1 or 2 years. Most growers are trying to do it for 2 years, but there's some who just do it as an annual planting. Tillamook is 3 years probably for most growers. And hood is usually 1 year or sometimes 2 years. So those figures might jump around a little bit if you sort of took into account how many years the plants are in the ground as far as reflection of acreage. If you look at who's buying what, I think that's pretty striking. If you're in British Columbia, you're pretty much buying Albion. I mean, it's all Albion, Seascape, a little bit of Puget Reliance and Rainier, and it's almost all fresh market because other than some roadside processing, their processing plants have all shut down. If you go to where the processing industry is in Oregon, Tillamook and Totem predominate, a lot of hood still and a lot of hood up in Washington, but you get down to some of these other varieties and it peters out, or more of a mix of different, from different states or different regions. Any questions on those plant sales or acreage figures? Okay. Talk a little bit about cultivar options, what you might want to grow. This is also first, I used to be an extension years ago. Like, hard to remember that back in 1989 to 1993, I was a state extension specialist for the state of Missouri, working at University of Missouri. So that's why some of these pictures look ancient, because they are. They're scanned from when I was an extension in Minnesota in the late 80s or Missouri in the 90s. But I just wanted to put in a plug. This is the thing that we always tried to emphasize whenever anybody started to get into fruit production, especially fresh fruit. People always ask the questions that we saw in that survey earlier. You know, how do you produce these things? What do you grow? In the end, usually the success is driven in these first three questions. What's your market? What's your market? What's your market? Who are you selling to? Where are they going to come from? What do they want to pick? You need to figure those things out before you really start figuring out some of the horticultural characteristics. I mean, you need to figure them out simultaneously, obviously, but are you going to sell at some sort of farmer's market? Are you going to do some value added and make pies or tarts or whatever? You know, is it going to be a you-pick operation or some mix of all the above? Other things that maybe will get plugged later, but I'd really encourage those of you who are interested in fresh market and roadside to consider becoming involved with. I know there's some growers like Matt Unger who've been involved with these groups, but the North American Strawberry Growers Association and the North American Farmers Direct Marketing Association. Both those groups are geared towards people doing roadside, smaller acreage, people who have direct interaction with their customers. Is not usually a wholesale arrangement, not usually a processing arrangement, unless it's all done on a smaller scale. And they have meetings, they have tours in the summers, they have a lot of different things you can get involved with, and certainly encourage you to think about doing that. Okay, now talk about cultivars. And what I did is I put a list together based on plant sales of the cultivars that I could find, and I added some of the newer ones that might not quite be on plant sales list yet. And I sent them out to a number of different fresh market growers in Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia. And I got a number of surveys back. I'm sure I didn't hit all of you, and I didn't get everything back from all of you, but that's okay. I thought we got a pretty good picture. But these, I also left some spots for blanks, cultivars that they had tried to grow or had thought about growing, and so they added a few to this list. And so, first of all, we have, we'll talk about the June bearers, and then I'll talk about the day neutrals. And Laura asked me, for most of you guys know the difference between those two, but for those of you who don't, I'll just give just a brief description of what the difference between a day neutral and a June bearing or short day type. The June bearing or short day types, which are Totem, Tillamook, Hood, all those things we really think of, are things that the flowers are initiated as the days get shorter in the fall, they begin to initiate flowers for the crop the following year. There's sort of two different kinds of ever-bearing strawberries. There's sort of the old ones that some of you may have grown in your garden or whatever, things like Ogallala and Ozark Beauty. A lot of these are still sold in garden centers. And they usually have a spring crop and a fall crop, and that's what we used to call ever-bearers. Not many people grow those commercially anywhere for any reason. What they've mostly switched to is what we call a day-neutral strawberry. And what this means is that the plant just keeps producing flowers as long as the environmental conditions are right, and fruit. Now, one of the tricky things about these, especially in the eastern US and somewhat here in the valley, is when it gets above 85 or 90 during the summertime, they stop flowering. And so you'll get gaps in your production depending on how hot it is. And so it's not just the day length, or that they won't just keep flowering, they also need it to be cool enough for them to keep flowering. So that's the difference between the two. This has certainly been traditionally our industry up here. But Albion, which is a really popular fresh market variety, is in this group down here. This is what most of the Northern California industry is based on up in Watsonville, and a variation on these June bearers is what the Southern California industry is based on. Okay, I'm going to go through each of these, and I'm going to follow a little bit of a format of talking a little bit about what researchers might say or the releases might have said when they first came out, and then the growers' feedback. First of all, in the survey I had tremendous differences of opinion, and for everybody who said that one is a horrible flavored thing, there was somebody who's saying our favorite for flavor. And so I think what I'll come back and say at the end is you really do need to get out in whatever way you can, whether you come to the station where we have some different types, whether you go to visit other pick your own or your roadside marketers in the area, you need to get out and try some different ones. So much of what works for you is going to depend on what you want to do. I mean, one of the recurring comments on the day neutrals is they need plastic culture, drip irrigation, really high level of management. Do you want to mess with that? So you need to know what you're willing to put in. Then you need to know your clientele and the market in the area. Starting off with Benton, so like I said, the first slide, sort of a researcher slide like I might use in any presentation. It was a standard back in the 70s, an old release from the USDA. Came out about the same time as Totem, but because it was so easy to grow and high yielding, a lot of growers hopped on it faster than Totem. They were willing to get a little bit of lower price even though the fruit was light colored. But when you froze Benton it and thawed it, it turned to mush, even though it tasted really good. And it was pretty much discarded as a processing berry. But then growers. What do growers like about it? They love the good yield and flavor. It's one that's very popular, specifically in the Russian and Mennonite communities. They like that flavor, and that has worked. If you have that kind of clientele, they may prefer that berry. For somebody, it was their most popular berry because the bush stands up well over a long period of time. You can leave it to pick. You can get around. If things aren't working, it's not going to darken like other berries. You can get back to it later. Tolerates most soils, and it's high yielding. Why wouldn't you grow it? Well, light color, it's small, it's a little bit tart, it's definitely soft. Some would say it's an off color. And I love this comment. I won't say who said that because they're in the room, but am I missing something? I'm surprised to see this one still on the list, and yet, if you were to go across the river to Vancouver, I think it's Joe Bedouin, it's his favorite berry. It works extremely well for him. So you did get those kind of different contrasts. I'm not sure what the market is, but it's not definitely, I sort of asked them, is it for pick your own, roadside, or wholesale fresh? This is one that you could probably do roadside and pick your own, but you're not going to want to do wholesale fresh. Charm, I'm going through these, I think in alphabetical order. It's a new release from our program. It's one that has good yields, very high yields. It's pretty much an ice cream berry. Reasons to grow, it's good yield, good size. In the first couple of years, this is in grower trials, good flavor. No name recognition, not enough known, and certainly it's a little bit soft. It's not going to be, it's probably going to be, might work as pick your own on-farm sales, but you're not going to want to move it anywhere. It's just too tender skinned. Hood. This has been a standard for ice cream manufacturers since the 60s. It is also one of the berries that has name recognition, especially here in Oregon, somewhat in Washington too. But you see all the signs out there, hoods are in. But it's pretty much only grown for local sales because it's plants aren't long-lived. They'll often die after the first year due to virus pressure or other pressures. And so it's a tougher berry for growers to grow. What would the growers say? Reasons to grow it, it's sort of one of our early season standards. It's got great name recognition. Some people think this is what an Oregon strawberry should taste like. Even though Toteman's been in the predominant acreage for Oregon, Hood is what a berry should taste like. It's great for freezing, consumer favorite. You can usually have pretty good size the first year. Reasons not to grow. Disease susceptible, not long lived, it can get small, it can have rot problems, it can be soft. And I like this grower's comment, it's got a shelf life of about 8 hours. And they also followed it up with, come on, if it was longer, California would grow these instead of the rocks they currently ship. So if you can make, it's one you sort of really need to consider having in your mix. We call this a standard fresh market June berry variety, and some people make a lot of money off this, but you do need to be aware that it's not as grower friendly as some other varieties. I think you can probably, well, we know it is all in all three markets right now. There's pick your own, there's wholesale fresh, selling Hood. Honey Eye is an eastern variety developed in New York back in the late 70s. It's the #1 variety, I think, still in the eastern U.S. other than Florida. I should have, it's not grown in Florida or the southeastern U.S., but if you're in New Jersey or Michigan or Ohio, this is what's going to be the #1 cultivar because It's early for them, or early to mid-season for them, but for some reason in our climate it's extremely early. It's good flavor, but it can get a bitter on some sites, and we've seen that in trials. Root rot susceptible, virus susceptible. If you look at what growers say, very early, that's why you're going to grow it. Some people think it tastes good. Other people over here say poor flavor. So this is the kind of contrast we got. And I think that's really reflective of honey eye. I mean, it really, I saw that many years ago in Minnesota when it was a new variety. Is you go to some farms and say, this is a really good tasting berry. And you go to the next one and like, why would anybody eat this? Because it has these bitter overtones that seem to come on certain locations. It's a really attractive berry, and it is pretty cold hardy. So it is one that's been grown in the interior of BC, and probably also could be grown in the interior in Washington. Yes?
Chad, do you have any reasoning as a researcher why it would be bitter in one place and not in another?
No. There's no good reason, and we'll make Dave Bryla cringe, but it's usually blamed on soils. But I can't point to something.
Soils or the level of
I think the profile of the soil. But I know from a science standpoint, it's hard to make that claim, but that's, I think, what, well, we've got a scientist here. We'll have Dave. I think it would be hard for, I mean, if you grow the plants well on either site, it's hard to believe that one would be bitter and one wouldn't, just because of the soil nutritional profile. But the other thing I should add is one of its parents of honey eye is holiday, and it was notorious for this too. And everybody's had these strawberries like this. There's the ones that say, oh, that's great. And then you sort of go, what's that? You know, it's one of those things that hits you late. It's not a nasty, bitter, like a nasty Darrow blackberry or something. Okay. A new one that's certainly being trialed a lot for fresh is Puget Crimson. It's a vigorous plant. It's very late season. This is one of the latest ones out there, especially in Washington. In Oregon, it's just late. I wouldn't say it's extremely late. And it can have these big, attractive fruit, but you can see one of its problems, even here when you pick a really nice flat of it, it's a pretty dark berry. And it can get over dark pretty fast. And so, you know, great growers, reasons to grow it, good color, good fruit quality. People do like to eat this one. People feel it'll replace Puget Summer, which is one we'll talk about in a minute. Very large, good production, easy to grow, not a very good long shelf life. As we found in our research plots, it's not necessarily very late. You know, we talk about it being very late, but as soon as we had it against Firecracker or Independence, which are impossible to find now, it was definitely earlier than those in Oregon, but not necessarily in Washington. It can have vigor problems. Both it and its Puget Summer, which was one of its parents, just don't do as well in Oregon as they do in Washington at most sites. Hard to fill a flat without damaging them. They can turn very dark, poor flavor when they get overripe, can have mildew. And some grower, I think we had one grower who turned in a survey from eastern Washington, out in Walla Walla area, and their comment was you really needed to put the water into this one. And that's probably because it's ripening as late in when it's starting to get warmer. Looks like it could probably go for most different markets. Puget Reliance has been a standard for many years in the fresh market. It's the whole Puget series is from Washington State University. It's a large one, durable plant, productive. Can have low fruit rot, pretty virus tolerant, it's very tender skinned. It was a nightmare to use as a parent. We had so many things going for it that we used a ton of it as a parent, but most of its offspring is the same. It tends to be tender skinned and large fruit. So you're walking down that road and you say, this looks great, and then you pick it and you realize you're not going to be able to ship that, or you're not even going to be able to move it very well. As far as what growers like, it's fairly early. It's often, up in British Columbia, it's sort of considered the early season standard. Even if you're growing Albion, you might put Puget Reliance out there to bring them on early onto the farm. Fair to good flavor. Another one that's a little bit difference of opinion on whether it's bland, whether it has no flavor or it's good flavor. But nobody jumps up and down about the flavor. It's okay. Good size, plants hold up well. It can tolerate some weevils most of the time. Productive, easy to pick. Open plant makes it really easy. Problems, it can ripen too quickly, it can get dark when it's overripe. It doesn't necessarily like wet soils, and it can be too tart. Softness is definitely an issue, but it has been used in all sorts of markets here, and certainly in Oregon it's been a lot in the farmer's market scene. The one that from WSU, I should have probably put these in order of release. This is Puget Summer. First release was Reliance, then it was Summer, and then it was Crimson, Puget Crimson. I think this one's going to disappear pretty quickly because this is sort of the same season as Puget Crimson. And it just hasn't been around. It has been around long. Puget Crimson has not, but it's medium fruit size, and it didn't do that well for us trials in Oregon. And I think a couple of the growers who responded to me in Oregon had problems growing it here. The reason to grow it is it's considered very late, certainly in Washington, not necessarily as much in Oregon. Good fruit quality, very much like Puget Crimson. The big advantage this has over Puget Crimson is much larger fruit and probably a little higher yield, but they're both really good to eat. Most people like to eat them. Very forgiving, easy to harvest, firm, good shelf life. Most people feel it'll be phased out in favor of Puget Crimson. It's really hard to get plants. For people who really like to grow it, the nurseries have had, they haven't been sure whether they were going to keep it in the market or not, and so the plants aren't always available. Sometimes it's hard to get going, and also often the primary fruit are very large, and then it goes way down in fruit size. So you're really impressed with it on that first berry, and then you're disappointed when you have to come back and pick all those small ones. Not always late, short shelf life. Old one, this is more up in Washington. I don't think I've seen much Rainier grown ever down here in Oregon, but since I'm USDA, I try to keep spread out over both Oregon and Washington. It was good fresh market berry for a long time, well known up in Washington, and often in Washington when I've driven up to the Linden area, you'll see a sign that says Rainiers are in, and they're talking about strawberries, not cherries, and you know, so they have a little bit of name recognition in Washington. Name recognition in Washington was recognized by the growers, have very large first berries, attractive and good color, but you know, there's other things that are probably better than it. Prone to rots. It's just got those big leaves that get matted down, it gets wet in there, it gets rotten in there, it's hard to control diseases, and so it's probably not a great one to choose now. Shuckson, this is probably one of the ones that gets the biggest differences in opinion. It was released because it was in a field after a winter, maybe not unlike the winter we just had, where everything around it died and it stood up. And it had some other good characteristics going for it, excellent flavor, but it's also known for being kind of rough. It may not show up well here, but a lot of creased berries and uneven berries, which for some people was a problem, and other people don't. They think it's a problem. But this is one, you know, most really like the flavor, but then you'll get over here, you know, things like this. Terrible flavor versus most really like the flavor. Fair to good yields. Some people would argue it's the best jam berry. Good size and yield first year, and it holds up better than Hood to the virus pressure and disease pressure. Downsides are it can ripen fast, size can get small, lots of misshapen, too soft, and BC they just don't even grow it. It is also one that's a little dicey on plant supply. There have been a couple of years recently where I know people who really like Shuckson and have that as part of their farm mix that have had a hard time getting plants. One of the more recent releases from our program, Tillamook, we released it because it's got very large fruit and high yield. You got to really let it hang to get sweet, or you need a really sunny spring. And the nice thing is there were some growers who are keeping it out as long as 5 years. I don't think anybody's going to do that commercially, but it's something that'll last in the ground a little longer. It's done really well for polybags, and it's probably about approaching half the Oregon processed crop. Reasons to grow it. Large fruit, everybody likes to pick them, they're easy to pick. But then this complaint, both as a positive and negative, it looks like a California berry. And there's certainly, I've heard stories of roadside market people being accused of bringing in California berries instead of growing their own. Because they are large and bright color, that light bright color that you expect in a fresh berry, and they don't think that's what should be grown in Oregon. And so there's a little bit of that. High yield, easy to pick, sometimes has a fall crop, which some people take a little bit of advantage of. Reasons not to grow, flavor questionable, not sweet are two of the biggest ones, and that's usually what divides people on Tillamook. Some people would say for the people who don't think it's sweet enough, you just need to let it hang for another week. And other people say, I can't do that, it just doesn't get sweet enough. So it's always sort of a tug back and forth. But I think it'd be a little bit of a challenge for pick your own, because they're just going to pick it when it's red, and they're not going to be thinking it's a delightful berry like some of the other ones. Some growers say it doesn't really grow well in really heavy soils, and it's just not growing in British Columbia. Old standard, this is a standard for processing, one of the standards, and it's old release from Ag Canada. It's been one of the standards since the 80s. It's always had a good combination of good yields, good enough quality. Growers like it, processors like it, but over the last probably 10 or 15 years, it just doesn't last like it used to. The disease problems are worse, Its size, it's hard for, especially when there's Tillamook out there, for people who are hiring contract crews, they have a harder time getting them to pick Tota when there's Tillamook around. But it still has a really significant role in Oregon. As far as for fresh market, good overall fruit quality, attractive, productive, all things you'd like to see. The challenge is, for some people, they just think it's too tart. It's too much. Processed berries is good to be tart because you add sugar to those things. It can get dark and poor flavor if it's let go overripe. It tends to have the fruit laying on the ground where the fruit can get splattered and damaged and rot more easily. So, like I said down here, half said they could grow it in any of these markets. Another half said they wouldn't grow it for any of these markets. So, real mixture there. Stolo, a newer release from Ag Canada that really is not that much out there, so I condensed it to one slide. Stolo's biggest trait, I think, that's interesting is it's tolerant of root weevil. It's got good yields, good fruit quality, but it'll stand up to weevils. Growers thought, it had decent flavor, medium size, firm, easy to harvest, open canopy were all the positive traits, but it got too small and there wasn't enough yield to probably plant it most of the time. Another new one from our program, Sweet Bliss. This has done very well it did very well in the Fraser River Valley. They were growing a lot of this. I think a lot of it's been replaced now that they're planting Albion, but it was grown for farmers markets in Vancouver, did well. Nice, attractive fruit, tastes very good. Its main problem has been is that sometimes you'll lose about 1 to 5% of the plant soon after planting. Not any problem with the nurseries. It's more, it seems to be susceptible to some diseases that either kill it right away or it's fine for the long haul. And I've never seen a whole planting taken out. It's always been this sporadic, a few plants down the row. Sweet Sunrise, which is a new release from us. It's really, once again, this is too new for growers to really know. But for growers who have tested it, who have fresh market, they're trying to plant it. The problem is plant availability. There's only a few thousand plants available this year. Next year there'll be more. The reason you would grow Sweet Sunrise is it's early. It's probably almost as early as Hood most years. While the data says it's as large as Tillamook, I think somehow the data's lying. It's not quite as big as Tillamook, even though we've really clearly measured that. But it's got good yields, high, very sweet, but it's also got that sweet tart balance, so it's going to taste more tart than something like Albion. Nice plant, and it's performed well in grower trials. Valley Red, too new to know really. Found it was easy to pick, open habit. Nice thing about Valley Red is very uniform plant, very uniform fruit size, probably mostly a processing berry. Some growers who've had it in tests found that it was very tolerant of root rot. You can tell exactly where the root rot exactly in a field that had root rot where the Valley Red started because the plants were standing up just fine. With that, I'll switch gear to what's out there in the day neutrals, or everbearing types. You could almost start and stop with this slide. Albion is a day neutral, meaning repeat fruiting through the summer. Good sweet taste, is by far the most widely planted, not only in the Pacific Northwest, but anywhere day neutrals are grown, this is probably what's grown. It's farm, large, good flavor, not intense flavor. What growers say, they say all the things I just said, best day neutral by far, acceptable quality, good flavor, maybe not as heat damage susceptible as some of the older day neutrals were, and good color and flavor if you wait. I think the main concerns are it doesn't have the flavor of a Hood. There's just no way. It can taste darn good, but it doesn't have the flavor of a Hood, for better or for worse. I mean, a lot of people like a sweeter flavor. But you need to be able to, if you're going to grow it right, you need plastic, drip irrigation, you need plastic culture system, and that's a level of grower knowledge that you need to be willing to accept before you're going to grow Albion. But certainly we know it works both in all different markets here in Oregon. The two newer ones that people have done a lot of experimenting with are Monterey and San Andreas. My take was that they're day neutral, but Albion was better. I just thought it had fair flavor, but I think overall growers find that they would really like to potentially grow these because they can get higher yields off of them, but they can't get a good enough fruit quality. Those aren't well known, and they found that Albion was better fruit quality for them, for most of them. I mentioned Mary de Bois because it gets all the press, but I don't know of any grower who's tried it or been happy with it or grown it. For us, it's a really virus susceptible plant. It's got this really unique flavor that is sort of musky that if you read the foodie press, they'll be all over this one. So that would be the reason to try it, but it's just hard to grow well in our experience. Other Old Day Neutral Seascape, this is certainly available to all the farmers, all the, as plants for garden centers. People really like to eat, and it's early, but the big problem when it's commercial grower is it's pretty low yield, and Albion's superior as a grower vary in just about every way. The old ones from the eastern US, Tribute and Tristar, taste great, fine if they're in your backyard garden, but they are really small. I mean, they start off medium size, and then they get small, and it just doesn't work in most commercial operations. And Albion would be a far better choice for them. With that, I'll stop and take any questions and open it up for discussion. But as I say, take a leap and try some of these. Any questions? Comments? Yes, Wendy.
Did you have any organic growers in your survey? Repeat the question.
Did I have any organic growers in the survey? I don't think so.
I have another question.
Yes.
Some people have noticed that Albion is not very durable, even the first or going into the second year. Do you think that's, or do growers have an opinion as to whether that's a result of not enough inputs, or the planting hasn't been maintained as well, or that's a problem that people are going to encounter all over?
I could answer that, but we are trying to encourage I could answer with my opinion, but we are trying to encourage discussion.
Right.
So, an Albion grower, Matt Unger, what do you think?
We're going to be trying our fourth year on one field this year. Actually, we see it fairly durable. Not to frost. I mean, winter damage. There's some winter damage out there, but there's enough ground, so it'll yield good.
And like, who was saying this though? Like, what production method were they growing the Albion under?
It's basically from seeing experience from a couple of farmers, two of whom actually were organic, so it may be an input issue. But also, I wonder if it doesn't grow as well in Washington. So if there are Washington growers who have experience, I'd be interested in that as well.
Sounds like it grows good in BC, though.
Exactly.
Right.
That's what I was thinking.
Sorry?
Sounds like it grows good in BC, though.
But growing good doesn't necessarily mean it, but from those tables, because it could just be 1 year, but in my experience talking to Tom Bauman up there, they're usually growing 2 years. So they are getting a second year in BC. But I think the feeling, there's lots of different places where there's really good growers who may not be getting a good second year. But I think a lot of the cases is just getting really good growth and really good plants and managing them well to bring on that second year in good shape. But other than that, I don't hear many people who are going that many years.
We're doing two normally and trying a third. We've tried a third before, but always had other issues every time there's an issue that comes up. I think, unknown, I think that's for us.
But you're pretty happy with the second year.
Yeah.
I mean, Wendy's talking about having problems getting a good second year even.
Comment was made about plastic culture, and I just say, so pick your own. I've had good experience without plastic with Albion. They've been fine.
Okay, so good experience with Albion without plastic culture. And how many years? Are you carrying for multiple years?
Yeah, we're going to try 3 here.
Okay, trying 3 years.
You know, I think the large number of varieties that have such opposing views, you know, good flavor, bad flavor, high disease, low disease, show that more work needs to be done in learning how to fertilize to take advantage of the genetic potential of those varieties.
Yeah. Yeah. On some of that, I totally agree with what you said. On the other hand, I think one of those contrasts too can be one of the things we find universally in plant breeding. If we want to just appeal solely to the buying public, consumers with a fresh product or an unsweetened product, you go for high sugars. You just say, the heck with the acids. Because what's going to happen is, on average, with something like a hood, or maybe not hood, let's say totem, there's this curve of from dislike to like that's sort of shifted away more towards dislike. And you get to something like Albion, and it just sort of levels down where it's, Matt's gonna kill me doing that. The people who love it don't, it almost ends up with a bimodal distribution on Totem, whereas it's more of a curve on Albion type things. In general, there's for a lot of different berries. If it's sweet, it doesn't offend anybody, but it doesn't have that big punch. But people who look at that big punch are not going to be happy with Albion, but they're only 20% of your marketplace. And so there's those kinds of things. And I think that's one of the reasons sometimes we get this distribution of if you, and I also compare it to, well, wine. Anybody who first starts drinking wine, especially if you're cheap and in college, you're drinking sweet box wines. And then if you keep drinking wines, you end up with these things that are, you know, these big old Merlots from California or Zins from California that make you pucker and have a lot of complexity. But you go out and serve that big old Zinfandel to the average consumer on the street, and they're going to say, I don't want that. And so I think that's why we sometimes get this disparate flavor scores is, you know, that kind of difference. Yeah, well, educated palate or, you know, whatever you want to call it. I mean, we know as breeders we're always snobs because we go out and taste strawberries every single day during the season. And lots of different varieties. So we know we like certain things, and on average I think most breeders are, you know, flavor snobs.
But flavor snobs to,
Big, complex flavor.
but the consumer, like from a consumer perspective, I mean, how would that weigh in from a consumer?
Well, I think it's a little bit of a disadvantage because
Exactly.
we like acidity,
Yeah, exactly,
and most consumers like sweetness.
right.
But I mean, like Hood has good acid to go with. I mean, you need them both to have that intense flavor.
You need them both, but I mean, I guess I haven't ever heard it talked about as much with Hood, but when you switch over to blackberries and you look at Marion, Marion's a high sugar, high acid berry. There's some people who don't like Marion. Whereas with Hood, I've never really met anybody who didn't like a Hood, even though they are high acids and high sugars. But they have consistently, if you look at Brian Yorgie's Brix levels on Hood over the years, Hood is almost always one of the top 3 to 5 on the list for Brix. So even though it does have those high acids, it always has those high Brix too.
But then you take Albion has lower sugars, but it still tastes sweet because it probably has all the acid.
Exactly. Yeah, if you do the Brix levels on Albion, it's usually lower, but the acids are way low.
What kind of yield are people getting on the first or second year out?
I don't have any idea. I don't know if anybody else is going to guess or even admit it. Would have been a good question to ask in that survey, but especially since I've kept those growers largely anonymous. I don't know. You want to guess? Matt, I know it wouldn't be you, but what do you think people on average are getting? Or what kind of drop do you think you get from first to second year?
On
Albion. No drop? A little drop?
Yeah, no drop. I think you can keep the yield up.
Between first and second year.
Does the fruit size drop a little bit?
Yeah.
So I'd sort of expect that. I mean, second year, he's saying you don't get much drop from first to second year in yield, but you might be picking more berries to make the same tonnage.
I mean, there's all different plants. You can plant in the fall, then that first year, you can plant in the spring. The first year is going to be lighter than the second. Size.
That's another thing that we don't even talk about, but you know, you go around the state, everybody's got a little different approach. I mean, I think one of the things we learned early on, well, not early on, as we mess around with these things in our breeding program is, for those of you who've grown June bearers, day neutrals are a very different beast. It's almost like a completely different crop, because when you're planting things, is when you want them to be a certain size, how you're treating them often can be very different than June bearers. Any other comments or questions?
Have you started any day neutral breeding in Oregon or Washington per se,
Yes.
or left it to California?
Yeah, Oregon and Washington and British Columbia all are messing around with day neutrality. The ones who are doing it the best right now is Washington State University with Wendy. And what it is that one of the things that really helps is Wendy is just nuts over these things. And so I would definitely pull her aside and talk to her as much as you can. Now, she's got the real passion for day neutrals. And so she's really partitioned their breeding program so that certain crosses are handled certain ways. And that's the way we would like to do it, but we have a hard time getting out of our June bearing routine, just because of our equipment, our farm managers, everything. It's harder for us. Ted and I have been trying for a number of years to really do it differently, and so we have been breeding day neutrals for 10 years. And we have a few selections that we like to get out, but we have, one of our big problems in our breeding program is we don't have a spray program that continues beyond spring bloom sprays for botrytis. And maybe our things are just especially susceptible, or maybe we need a spray program to get no anthracnose. And so one of the things we're going to work with is trying to get some of our selections quickly to some growers to see if they have potential under a commercial setting as 5 plant plots or even less, just to see if they can grow in a commercial setting. So I hopped around a little. Tom?
One of the problems I know with growing Albion here is differentiating Northwest berries from California berries. If everybody's got Albion, it makes it more difficult.
Has everybody got that?
Claims that the Oregon Albions taste a lot different than the California Albion. Could you comment on that at all?
Yeah, well, first of all, his comment was, right now there's a different marketplace for Albion and Northwest cultivars. If everybody starts growing Albion, what does that mean? Especially if we're now growing the exact same thing you get down in California. Further, it's then argued, well, we grow them a lot better. We taste a lot better up here in Oregon. I know growers who really believe that. And there is justification for that at some level. I mean, certainly, one of the reasons we have the monstrous berry industry we do in the Northwest is because we have the ideal climate for color and flavor development. We have moderate days, full of sunshine, cool nights as opposed to warm nights. So we get that temperature difference, which leads to more flavor development. So there is really, you can argue that is the case. Plus, in Oregon, we're usually somewhere between 8 hours and 36 hours from the consumer. Whereas in California, even if you're doing things really well, you got to pick them a little earlier to get them up here to sell. So there are going to be some differences. But I've tasted good Albion everywhere, and I would argue that even though some growers don't agree with me, it's a sweet, pleasant berry. But I don't go, wow. So, but maybe you don't need to sell wow.
Looking at the statistics here for 2011 and 2012 for Oregon, only about 15 or 20% of the strawberries are sold fresh market. Is that because they can't hold the quality and it has to go to processing, or is just the market not there?
I wouldn't say the market's not there, but they're choosing the varieties they're growing, and the way they're growing them is specifically for the processing market, for the 85% that's going, or 80 to 85% that's going to market. Our processing is not a byproduct of our fresh market as the California industry is. California, their seconds go to processed, and then a big chunk of what goes to process is when Southern California, when Northern California quality gets good enough in April or May, the quality in Southern California is not good enough. So all those fields down there start picking on longer rotations so the fruit redden up, and that goes to the freezing plant. It's either that or rain damaged fruit from the north, or misshapen fruit from the north, or too big a fruit from the north. But they're all geared towards fresh. We are geared towards processing for the people who sell processing markets.
There's another factor too, which is we really, when I asked you like how is that survey information pulled, I was trying to get at that we don't have really scientific data on how much fresh market strawberries are being grown and sold out there, because a lot of the fresh market isn't being sold at the supermarket. And so there's not mandated collection information if it's at a farm stand or farmer's market. So there really isn't, at this point in time, a real good, other than plants sold and stuff like that. But we don't have the industry, we don't have a handle on how much actual fresh market strawberries are actually being sold.
Yeah, because there's no mechanism for it to be reported.
The price differences here suggest to me somebody'd be looking at it pretty hard.
Pros and cons. I mean, it's just like anything. It's like you see that price and you light up, but you got to do a darn good job. You've got in both markets, but you got to deal with a lot of people as customers as opposed to a workforce. So either way, you got labor issues or people issues. But you know, do you want a bunch of people on your farm for that price, messing up your stuff? Some people can't handle that at all.
So any last question before we move on into the grower panel that we've got set up? All right, thanks, Chad.